to get to the very heart of the story of how the universe works, you've got to look beyond books with all their texts, and beyond instruments with all their fancy measures, and beyond teachers with all their fine words, and beyond our five senses with all their exquisite receptors, and beyond our thoughts with all their clever rationales. It turns out that beyond all these amazing facilities, we have got to get to something that affects everything else we use. To get to the heart of the story of how the universe works, we first have to go to the heart of our psyche. We have to explore the interface of our conscious and subconscious being. We have got to get to the point at which self-awareness emerges in a human being. Yes, to understand in a scientific way how everything works, we first have to get to know a very specific element of our psyche, the element we call the ego. The more you get to know about the ego, the more you're going to understand how the universe works. First of all, it is helpful to know that much of the way we view the world is not determined by science. Rather, it is determined by the ego. Indeed, the ego largely determines how we view science. Our eyes do not determine most of what we see. No, we mainly see with the ego. What about our ears? No, most of what we hear is determined by our ego. And our ego largely does our smelling, tasting and feeling for us too. You see, the ego is very, very social. It wants to be in on every conversation we have. More than that, it tries to control and suppress every conversation by insisting that we don't really need to bother to listen to other people, to the universe, to anything, because it knows everything already. Yes, the ego is central to how we get to the heart of the story of how the universe works. So much so you will find that every thought we have, every emotion we experience, and every story we create of how the universe works is largely shaped by the ego. It is shaping your experience of this video right now. You see, the ego is like a super glue. It grabs and adheres to every sensation we experience, including every thought we have, and bonds them together into a seeming coherent worldview. The ego is very, very good at attachment. It attaches us to things in many ways. It can form powerful lattices of bonds to money and minerals in our economics. It can form very potent emotional structures in our psychology. It can form incredibly intricate systems of faith in our religion. If you imagine this power of the ego for attachment presents us with an enormous challenge, then imagine again. Include the fact that the ego is unbelievably good at self-deceit, and the ego becomes perhaps the biggest challenge we face. So, what exactly is the ego? Well, the human being consists of a trace conscious element and a vast subconscious. This vast subconscious continually interacts in myriad ways with the greater universe. Very briefly, the ego is the central part of the human mind that interacts and mediates with the vast subconscious of the psyche. As Eckhart Tolle puts it, the ego is a conglomeration of recurring thought forms and conditioned mental emotional patterns that are invested with a sense of I. So included in these thought and emotional patterns of the ego is the belief that the ego is the total human being. The ego attaches us to this belief with extraordinary ingenuity and constantly works to maintain this bond. However, a human being is probably constituted of more than the ego, probably much more. In fact, it is estimated that while a human being is consciously sentient of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 interactions with the universe in any moment, we are actually sentient of at least 50 billion, maybe 100 billion interactions in that moment at a subconscious level. Every cell of our being contains knowledge that is at least 1 billion years old. Every cell is in some way sentient of and connected to the chemical, electrical, gravitational and other manifestations of existence. The ego can neither know nor compute all these permutations, and yet it insists that it knows all. Ever the great trickster, the ego insists, I am the human being. It's a little bit like the riverbank saying, I am the river. Sure, the riverbank is the river, but there's a lot more to the river than the riverbank. It is this incredible ability of the ego to grab on, to attach us to all manner of things, plus its inherent arrogance and capacity for self-deceit that constantly gets us into trouble. As with consciousness, the ego is just a trace element of the human being. However, what starts with tiny elements like the ego can lead us, if we are not very careful, into big trouble. And in this series we will show you how. Part 2 shows how the ego makes attachments. Part 3 shows how these attachments can be broken. Part 4 shows a way of transcending the ego. And Part 5 will show you the wonderful world beyond the ego. My very special thanks to all contributors, especially the NPR video series on carbon and climate. This series on the role of the ego is modelled and amplifies that work. There is more, much more at the Sustainability Principle website. Enjoy.